They say the mountains hold their own kind of secrets, things deep in the earth that should have stayed buried, and I reckon I'm starting to believe that now. I've been working these Appalachian hills my whole life, first as a miner and later as a gravedigger. After years spent digging, you learn to understand the earth, to feel its shifts and creaks. But no matter how much you think you know it, the land can always surprise you. It started with the graves, or more accurately, with the things that began crawling out of them. My name's Eli Barker. Most folk around here just call me Barker, and that's fine by me. The town of Carrick's Hollow ain't big, never has been, and I don't need much more than a few acres to call home. After the mines started closing, work got scarce for a man like me, so I found myself a new line of work, burying the dead. The money wasn't much, but it kept me fed and out of trouble. There's something peaceful about it too, being alone with the dirt and the quiet. The dead don't talk back, and I like that just fine. But a few weeks back, something changed. Folks had been talking about strange happenings around town, graves disturbed, bones dug up and missing. At first, I figured it was just some wild animal. These woods are full of critters, and it ain't the first time a coyote's gone sniffing around a fresh grave for a meal. But this wasn't no animal. The first body that went missing was old Mrs. Kincaid's. She'd been dead near 10 years, buried up on the hill by the big oak tree. The sheriff came by to tell me about it one morning, his brow furrowed in that way that made it clear he wasn't buying the wild animal theory. "Barker," he'd said, "I need you to come up to the graveyard with me. Something's wrong with Mrs. Kincaid's plot." I followed him up the hill, and sure enough, her grave had been torn open. Not dug, torn like something had ripped its way out from beneath the dirt. The coffin was splintered into pieces, and there wasn't a trace of her left. Not even a bone. "I ain't never seen nothing like this," the sheriff muttered, scratching his chin. "What kind of animal could do this?" "Don't reckon it's an animal," I replied, keeping my voice low. I didn't want to say what was really on my mind, but I was thinking it. I'd been hearing whispers from the townsfolk, things about shadows in the woods, strange lights near the graveyard late at night. But you don't talk about those things openly. Not around here. Folks get nervous real easy when you mention things that don't make sense. "Well, we better figure it out," the sheriff said, his face grim. "Last thing we need is folks panicking." I nodded, though in my gut, I already knew it wasn't going to be that simple. It wasn't long before more graves were disturbed. One after another, the dead started going missing. Every time it was the same. The graves torn open, the coffins shattered, and the bones gone without a trace. I tried telling myself it was just a coincidence, that there had to be a logical explanation, but the truth was clawing at the back of my mind. Then, late one night, I saw it for myself. I was out by the graveyard, checking on some plots I'd been filling in that day. It was a quiet, cool evening, the kind that settles in your bones and makes you feel like you're the only man in the world. The moon hung low over the trees, casting long shadows across the hillside, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. That's when I heard it, the faint creak of bones. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch snapping underfoot. But as I turned toward the sound, my breath caught in my throat. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. It was tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow, but it wasn't the shape of a man. No, this thing was moving wrong, like it wasn't in control of itself. Its limbs jerked and twisted unnaturally, and the way it moved, it was like a puppet on strings being tugged and pulled by something unseen. I took a step back, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it, the skeleton. Or at least, what was left of it. The figure was controlling the bones of the dead, stringing them together like marionettes. The bones moved as if they were alive, but there was no life in them, just the creaking, groaning movements of something that should have stayed buried. I froze, watching as the creature moved deeper into the graveyard, dragging the skeleton along with it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees, leaving behind nothing but silence. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept playing back what I'd seen, the way the bones moved, the unnatural way they twisted and turned. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But I knew one thing for sure. Something had come to Carrick's Hollow, something dark and ancient, and it wasn't finished yet. Over the next few days, the disappearances got worse. Graves were being dug up faster than I could fill them in, and the townsfolk were starting to notice. People whispered about the dead coming back to life, about creatures in the woods that controlled the bones of the dead. Some said it was a curse, others said it was the devil himself, but no one had any answers. The sheriff tried to keep things calm, but it wasn't long before panic set in. Folks started locking their doors at night, refusing to go near the graveyard, and the church was fuller than it had been in years. But no amount of prayers could stop what was coming. I started seeing them more frequently. The creatures, the ones I called the Marrow Puppeteers, they weren't human, not in the way we understand. They were made of shadows and bones, their long, thin limbs stretching out like strings as they manipulated the dead. And they didn't just control the skeletons of the newly dead. No, they could dig up bones that had been buried for decades, pulling them from the earth like forgotten toys. It didn't matter how long someone had been dead. Once the Marrow Puppeteers got their hands on the bones, they could bring them to life again. And the worst part? The bones remembered. They moved with a purpose, like they still held the memories of the people they once belonged to. I started keeping a close eye on the graveyard, staying up late into the night, watching for any signs of the creatures. I tried to tell myself I was just being cautious, that I needed to protect the town. But deep down, I knew I was afraid. I was afraid of what might happen if they came for me. One night, about 2 weeks after I'd first seen the Puppeteers, something happened that I still can't explain. I was out at the graveyard again, sitting by the old oak tree that overlooked the plots. The moon was full, casting a pale light across the headstones, and the air was still, almost too quiet. I hadn't seen the Puppeteers in a few nights, and I was starting to think maybe they'd moved on, maybe whatever they'd come for was done. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first I thought it was just the wind, rustling the leaves. But then I saw the figure, thin, gaunt, its limbs stretched out like they were made of string. It moved with that same unnatural grace, its body jerking and twisting as it made its way toward the graves. And this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, there were others. Skeletons, dozens of them, their bones clattering together as they marched in unison. They moved like one, their heads turning in perfect synchronization, their empty eye sockets staring straight ahead. I watched, frozen in place, as the Puppeteers led the skeletons through the graveyard. They didn't stop at any of the graves. They just kept moving, like they had somewhere they needed to be. That's when I realized they were heading for the town. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, stumbling over the roots of the old oak tree. I couldn't let them reach the town. I couldn't let them take more people. But what could I do? I was just one man, and these things, they weren't natural. They weren't something you could fight with a shovel or a gun. Still, I had to try. I grabbed the nearest tool I had, a rusty old pickaxe I used for digging, and started after them. The ground was uneven, and the night air was thick with fog, but I pushed forward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The Puppeteers didn't seem to notice me. They just kept moving, their bony puppets following in lockstep. As I got closer, I could see the way they controlled the skeletons. Thin strands of something, maybe it was thread, maybe it was magic, I don't know, were wrapped around the bones, pulling and guiding them like marionettes. The Puppeteers' fingers twitched and flexed, and with each movement, the skeletons followed. I raised the pickaxe, my hands trembling as I tried to summon the courage to strike. But just as I was about to swing, one of the skeletons turned its head toward me. It was Mrs. Kincaid, or at least what was left of her. Her skull was cracked, her jaw hanging open in a permanent scream, but I recognized the gold locket that hung around her neck. I'd buried her myself years ago, and now here she was, marching alongside the dead. The sight of her stopped me in my tracks. My hand fell to my side, the pickaxe slipping from my grip as I stared at the thing that had once been a person I knew. The Puppeteers didn't care. They just kept moving, dragging the bones of the dead along with them. And then as I watched, something strange happened. The skeletons stopped, all of them at the same time, their heads turned in unison, their empty eye sockets staring directly at me. My blood ran cold. Before I could move, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. I stumbled backward, trying to keep my balance as the earth shifted and cracked. The graves around me split open, dirt and stone flying into the air as more skeletons clawed their way to the surface. The puppeteers had called them. They had brought the dead back to life. And now they were coming for me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the graveyard. The sound of bones clattering together followed me, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel them, feel the weight of their empty gaze, the pull of their invisible strings. They were hunting me. I made it back to town just before dawn, collapsing on the steps of the church, gasping for breath. My body ached, my muscles burning from the effort of running, but I was alive. For now, the town was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of birds chirping, no chatter from the marketplace, no voices at all, just silence. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking as I made my way toward the sheriff's office. I had to tell him what I'd seen. I had to warn the town. But when I reached the center of town, I stopped dead in my tracks. The streets were empty, not just quiet. There were no people, no animals, nothing. It was like the entire town had vanished overnight. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the square. Its limbs were long and spindly, its body shrouded in shadow. And behind it, marching in perfect unison, were the skeletons. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all of them moving with that same unnatural grace, their bones clattering together as they approached. The puppeteers had come for the town, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I don't know how long I've been hiding in this old church, but it feels like forever. The town is gone now, overrun by the dead. The puppeteers control everything. Every bone, every skeleton, every memory of what this place used to be. I can hear them outside, their bony fingers tapping against the walls, their invisible strings pulling at the souls of the dead. They're waiting for me to slip up, to make a sound, to give them a reason to take me too. But I won't let them. Not yet. The dead may be under their control, but I'm still alive. For now, the door to the church creaks open and I hold my breath. They're here. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. But I won't go quietly, not without a fight.